A single seashell linked continents long before the first written word. This is the story of the prehistoric trade networks that connected our world. By the end, you will see the map of ancient history completely redrawn, revealing a planet already woven together by invisible threads of exchange. How did volcanic glass from Turkey end up in the hands of a Mesopotamian artisan? What compelled someone to carry a cowrie shell from the Maldives all the way to ancient China? We are about to trace these journeys back to their origins. What does it say about us that the desire to connect is written into our deepest past? That farmer, holding a tool of distant stone, was part of a system far older than money. Prehistoric trade, in its truest sense, was the movement of objects, ideas, and people across vast landscapes long before empires or caravans. It was exchange without ledgers, commerce without coins, a silent conversation conducted over generations. This was not about profit in the modern sense. Instead, it wove together through threads of social obligation, ceremonial gift-giving, and the fundamental human drive to acquire what one's own land could not provide. A community living in flint-rich hills might trade their stone for the obsidian, that volcanic glass, held by neighbors from a distant volcano. That obsidian might then travel further, passed along in a chain of mutual need and social connection. Archaeologists call this a down-the-line exchange network. Think of it not as a merchant's direct journey, but as a slow, relentless game of pass the parcel played across centuries, where the parcel could be a seashell, a rare stone, or a precious bead. Each handoff strengthened a bond, created an obligation, and slowly built a web of interdependence that spanned continents. This system did more than move materials. It moved knowledge. The technique for shaping that distant flint traveled with it. Stories, beliefs, and artistic styles hitched a ride. A simple tool becomes a catalyst, laying the psychological groundwork for all complex society that followed. It taught our ancestors a profound lesson, that survival and prosperity could be found not just in your own territory, but in your connections beyond it. The objects they chose to send on these epic journeys were never random. They carried meaning, value, and power that spoke directly to the human spirit. That glossy black stone was more than just a tool. It was a passport from another world. Obsidian, born in the fiery heart of a volcano, forms a glass so pure it can be flaked into an edge sharper than any surgical steel. For a prehistoric community, possessing it was a technological leap. But here is the true marvel. That leap was often made possible by a handshake across hundreds of miles. An artisan in ancient Çatalhöyük, a vast settlement in what is now Turkey, might hold a core of this volcanic glass, carefully striking it to produce blades and scrapers. Yet the volcano that created that specific glass was not a local landmark. Through a science called geochemical fingerprinting, archaeologists can match an artifact to the exact volcanic flow it came from, sometimes pinpointing a source over 500 miles away. This tells a story not of random wanderers but of intentional, sustained connection. By the 8th millennium before the Common Era, obsidian from central Anatolia was traveling south and east. It has been found in early villages across the Levant and far into Mesopotamia. This means that long before the wheel was invented, before the first city was built, people had established routes, or more accurately, relationships that could move high-value goods across staggering distances. Think of it as a prehistoric highway system, but one made of social bonds rather than paved roads. The journey of a single obsidian core was not a single merchant's daring trek. It was likely passed from group to group, village to village, in a chain of exchange that required mutual understanding. Each handoff was a transaction built on more than material need. It was an act of diplomacy, a building of trust, and a reinforcement of social ties. The person who finally crafted it into a blade carried not just a superior tool, but a symbol of their community's place in a wider world. This network of volcanic glass reveals a fundamental truth: our ancestors were not isolated tribes. They were participants in a conversation that spanned continents, a conversation conducted in the silent, eloquent language of stone. The journey of stone was practical, a dialogue of utility. But the prehistoric web carried whispers of something more profound. Picture a chieftain laid to rest far from any ocean in the heart of ancient Europe. His resting place is marked not by local treasures, but by a startling collage of distant lands. Around him are beads of iridescent shell from the warm Mediterranean and pendants of golden amber from the cold Baltic shores. These materials crossed continents to meet in this single, silent ceremony. They were not tools, they were stories made solid, their value measured in beauty, rarity, and the sheer impossibility of their presence here. This was the allure of the exotic, a powerful engine of trade long before luxury markets existed. Take the spondylus shell, a spiny, vibrant creature from the Aegean Sea. To a farming community in Central Europe, this object was a fragment of another universe. It had traveled over 1,000 miles, passed from hand to hand across mountains and rivers to finally rest in a grave. Its value was inseparable from its journey. It was not just a shell, it was proof of a connection to a world of unimaginable distance and difference. Similarly, amber from the Baltic coast, fossilized tree resin holding sunlight captive for millions of years, began an even more epic voyage. It moved south and west, reaching the glittering palaces of Mycenaean Greece and, centuries later, the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. For the people who carried it, this golden stone may have been tears of the gods or captured pieces of the sun. Its transport required navigating not just geography, but entire worlds of meaning. Crossing from the northern pine forests to the Mediterranean coasts meant moving between completely different cultures, languages, and beliefs. That such an object could make that journey tells us it operated on a different level than simple commerce. These items were likely tokens of something far greater than personal adornment. A single spondylus shell bead or a lump of Baltic amber could symbolize an alliance between distant clans, a seal of friendship that spanned the map. It could mark an individual's high status, showing they had the social reach to acquire the impossible. Most powerfully, these materials were often believed to hold spiritual power. The shell from a distant, life-giving sea might carry protective magic. The amber, warm to the touch and electrostatic, might be seen as holding a living force. Here we see the full dimension of these ancient networks. They moved more than commodities, they moved meaning. The drive to acquire such exotica was driven by human emotion, by belief, by the deep need to own a piece of the mysterious and the sacred. This transforms our understanding of prehistoric trade. It was not merely an economic system, it was a circulatory system for human dreams, connecting continents through a shared language of wonder. But how can we possibly trace these silent conversations across millennia? The evidence does not come from written ledgers or merchant accounts. It is whispered by the objects themselves, in languages only science and careful observation can now translate. Envision an archaeologist in a laboratory, not a dusty trench, peering through a high-powered microscope at a simple pottery shard. What they are searching for is not a grand inscription, but something far more telling: microscopic residues of a plant that could never have grown in the local soil. The ghost of a spice, an oil, or a resin from a continent away, trapped in the ceramic fabric for thousands of years. This is the quiet, meticulous detective work that maps the invisible. One of the most powerful tools is provenance study, the geological fingerprinting of materials. Just as we saw with obsidian, scientists can analyze the unique chemical signature of a jade axe, a copper bead, or a turquoise pendant. They can then match that signature to a single, specific source: a quarry in the Alps, a mine in the Sinai Desert, a lone outcrop in distant Mesopotamia. When that object is found hundreds of miles from its birthplace, it becomes a data point on a prehistoric map, a single dot that proves a line of connection existed. But the evidence is not just about where things came from, it is also about how ideas traveled. Archaeologists track the spread of stylistic influences, like a particular way of decorating pottery or a unique symbol carved into stone. If the same spiral motif appears on pottery in the Balkans and centuries later on artifacts in Central Europe, it suggests more than coincidence. It hints at the movement of people, or at the very least, the transmission of culture along those same exchange routes. The goods themselves became messengers. The discovery of Baltic amber in a Mycenaean tomb or of African ivory in a Levantine city are not accidents. They are the end points of journeys. By plotting the find spots of a specific type of shell bead or a distinct style of flint arrowhead, a distribution pattern emerges on the map. These patterns are not random scatter, they form trails, corridors of contact that bypass natural barriers and link fertile valleys and coastal plains. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from burial contexts. When an individual is laid to rest with goods from a far-off land, it speaks volumes. It tells us that connection was valued enough to be taken into the afterlife. That exotic shell or rare stone was not just a trade good, it was part of a person's identity, a testament to their place in a network that stretched beyond the horizon. Together, these silent messengers, the chemical fingerprints, the shared artistic styles, the far-flung grave goods, weave a story of gradual, persistent interaction. They reveal that communities we once thought of as isolated were, in fact, participants in a slow, continent-spanning conversation, a dialogue conducted not with words, but with objects charged with meaning and desire. The most compelling evidence for these ancient webs is written not in words but in a color, a deep, celestial blue veined with flecks of gold like a starry night. This is Lapis Lazuli, and its journey is a map of the prehistoric world in miniature. Its only known source in the ancient world was a single, remote valley in the mountains of Badakhshan, in what is now Afghanistan. From this one harsh and isolated point, this stone began an epic voyage that would last for millennia, connecting empires that never knew each other's names. To understand its path is to trace the very arteries of early civilization. By the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, this Afghan blue was appearing in the royal tombs of in Sumer, crafted into exquisite beads and the eyes of sacred statues. 1,000 years later, it was inlaid into the golden funeral mask of the boy King Tutankhamun in Egypt, a divine stone for a god-king. The distance between the mine and the Nile is over 3,000 miles of some of the most formidable terrain on Earth, crossing the Iranian plateau, the rivers of Mesopotamia, and the deserts of the Levant. This was not a journey made by a single caravan. It was a relay race across generations, a chain of specialized traders and intermediaries. Each segment of the route was controlled by different cultures, from the Harappans of the Indus Valley to the Mesopotamians, the Canaanites, and finally the Egyptians. The stone moved through a series of handoffs, each transaction increasing its value and mythic status. By the time a lump of raw lapis reached a royal workshop in Egypt, it was worth more than its weight in gold. Its value was inextricable from its impossible origin. It was quite literally a piece of the sky, a fragment of the divine, brought from the edge of the known world. This transformed it from a mere commodity into a symbol of ultimate power and heavenly connection, reserved exclusively for royalty and the gods they represented. The sustained demand for this single stone did more than enrich traders. It forged the first diplomatic channels. To ensure the flow of lapis, kingdoms had to maintain stable relations with their neighbors along the route. Messengers, gifts, and royal envoys traveled these same paths, carrying not just goods, but languages, artistic motifs, and technologies. The Lapis Lazuli route became a corridor for civilization itself, proving that the hunger for beauty and the sacred could build connections sturdy enough to link continents, thousands of years before the Silk Road was even a dream. Lapis Lazuli traveled a mountainous relay, but the true superhighways of the ancient world flowed with water. Envision a hollowed-out log canoe, heavy with polished stone axes and bundles of animal hides, gliding silently down a wide, sun-dappled river like the Danube. For the people of prehistory, rivers were not barriers, they were invitations. They provided a smooth, predictable path through dense forests, across marshlands, and around impassable mountains. A journey that might take weeks on foot could be accomplished in days by water, and it allowed communities to transport something revolutionary: bulk. A single canoe could carry the equivalent of what a dozen people could manage on their backs, transforming trade from an exchange of precious trinkets into a movement of foundational materials. This is how the very fabric of early society spread. The Neolithic revolution, that shift from hunting and gathering to farming, did not march across Europe, it floated. The package of domesticated wheat, sheep, pottery, and new ideas moved not over hilltops, but along the interconnected waterways of the continent. Farmers in Central Europe were not isolated pioneers. They were nodes in a riverine network, receiving seeds, animals, and techniques that had journeyed hundreds of miles by current and paddle. Where rivers met the sea, an even broader horizon opened. Coastal cabotage, the practice of sailing from cove to cove, headland to headland, allowed for cautious but steady exploration. By the 4th millennium before the Common Era, boats were plying the Mediterranean, carrying not just obsidian and shells, but now the heavy, bulky products of a settled life. Amphorae of olive oil from Crete, jars of wine from the Aegean Islands, and distinctive painted pottery began to appear in coastal settlements far from their origin. This was no longer just about rare ritual objects, it was about the staples of culture and cuisine. In the Arabian Peninsula, similar coastal routes connected the cultures of Mesopotamia with the resource-rich lands of Dilmun and Magan, trading in copper, fine stone, and pearls. These aquatic corridors did more than move goods, they moved people and their worldviews. A sailor resting at a coastal campfire would share stories, techniques, and beliefs as readily as he traded his cargo. The boat became a vessel for civilization itself, reducing the daunting friction of distance to a rhythmic pull of the oar or the billow of a simple sail. This fundamental expansion of scale changed everything. When you can move heavy grinding stones, large timber, or hundreds of pottery vessels, you enable the growth of permanent villages into towns, and towns into the first cities. The river and the sea did not just connect places, they built the very capacity for complex society, creating a world where the most distant shore was always just one current away. A stone axe or a shell necklace traveled not as a simple purchase, but as a promise. To understand the true engine of these ancient networks, we must step away from modern ideas of commerce and into the realm of social ritual. Envision a shoreline meeting under a full moon, where leaders from neighboring islands do not barter, but ceremoniously present each other with ornate shell armbands and necklaces. This is the Kula ring of the Pacific, a timeless practice observed by anthropologists, and it offers a stunning window into the prehistoric mind. These shell valuables, called solava and emwali, are not worn or used. Their sole purpose is to travel. A man will receive an armband from a partner in one direction and is obligated to later give a necklace of equal prestige to that same partner, moving it along the ring in the opposite direction. The objects themselves are temporary, but the relationships they forge are permanent, binding entire archipelagos together in a web of mutual obligation and trust. This was not trade for material gain, it was trade for social survival. The shell moving in a slow, ceremonial circle was a physical token of a far more vital exchange, an exchange of information, of political alliance, and of guaranteed safe passage. If a community faced hardship, the bonds created through this ritual exchange became their safety net, connecting them to resources and allies far beyond their own shores. This concept, often called a gift economy, likely powered many of the prehistoric networks we have traced. When that obsidian core moved from hand to hand across Anatolia, or when Baltic amber was passed south toward the Mediterranean, each transfer may have been framed as a ceremonial gift, creating a debt of honor and a bond of friendship. It transformed strangers into partners and hostile territory into a landscape of known connections. This system did more than move objects, it moved people. The exchange of marriage partners often flowed along these same established trade routes, weaving genetic and cultural threads together across vast distances. A daughter sent to marry into a distant Flint working community would carry with her the stories, traditions, and kinship ties of her homeland, strengthening the bond between the two groups far more durably than any single transaction. In this light, the prehistoric trade network emerges as something far grander than an economic system. It was a colossal, continent-spanning mechanism for building peace. By creating a chain of reciprocal obligations, it made conflict between connected groups more costly and cooperation more beneficial. The true currency was not the obsidian or the amber, but the relationship itself. The goods were merely the beautiful, physical expressions of a profound human need, to not be alone in a vast and unpredictable world, to weave a web of mutual care so strong it could hold entire societies together across the wilderness. The web of social bonds was vital, but another network was built on a far more primal need. A deep craving written into our very biology carved paths across continents. This was the hunger for salt. Without this simple mineral, our bodies cannot function, and our food spoils within days. In a world before refrigeration, salt was not a luxury, it was life itself. This biological imperative transformed remote salt springs and hidden mines into the earliest economic hubs, drawing people from hundreds of miles away. Visualize a line of people and animals, a slow caravan snaking its way toward a remote valley where a brine spring seeps from the earth. They carry grain, pottery, and hides, not for casual exchange, but for a substance as essential as water. Their journey is one of survival, not curiosity. Evidence for this deep-time salt trade is etched into the landscape. By the Neolithic period, communities were actively producing salt, boiling brine in clay pots over fires to harvest the precious crystals. But one site stands as a monument to salt's world-shaping power, Hallstatt. Nestled high in the Austrian Alps, this place is not just a mine, it is a time capsule. For over 3,000 years, from the late Bronze Age through the Iron Age, people tunneled into the mountain to extract rock salt. The wealth it generated was staggering. The miners and their families lived in a thriving community, their graves filled with bronze tools, intricate jewelry, and imported glass beads from the Mediterranean. Hallstatt was not an isolated village, it was a prehistoric industrial center, its influence radiating out across Europe. The salt from its dark tunnels traveled on the backs of traders and down rivers, reaching communities that had no access to their own sources. This created a simple, unbreakable dynamic. Control over salt meant control over life. A community sitting atop a salt spring held immense leverage. They could demand food, tools, labor, or loyalty from their neighbors in exchange for the vital mineral. This often translated directly into political power, forming the economic foundation for early chieftains and proto-states. The constant, predictable need for salt did something else profound. It institutionalized movement. The quest for this humble mineral established the first dedicated trade corridors, paths worn deep by countless footsteps over generations. These were not meandering trails, but regular, reliable routes. And where travelers rested, where they met to exchange their salt for other goods, settlements naturally took root. Trading posts became villages, and villages became towns, all sprouting along these salty lifelines. In this way, the biological need for salt did more than preserve food. It helped preserve and connect human society itself, laying down the literal pathways that would one day carry empires. Salt built the pathways, but what traveled upon them was far more transformative than any mineral. The true cargo of these ancient highways was knowledge itself. A profound cognitive leap could travel thousands of miles, not carried by conquering armies, but in the skilled hands of a single wandering artisan. Consider the revolutionary moment when the secret of metal first crossed a mountain range. For millennia, humanity's world was shaped by stone and wood. Then, somewhere in the highlands of Anatolia or the Caucasus, people discovered that certain colorful rocks, when heated in the right conditions, would yield a glowing, liquid substance that cooled into something miraculous: copper. This was not just a new material, it was a new reality. The individual who mastered this fiery magic, the smith, held a power akin to alchemy, and smiths, like their precious creations, were mobile. They traveled. As they moved along established trade routes from village to village, they carried the entire technological package in their minds and hands: the knowledge of finding ore, building furnaces, achieving the correct temperature, and crafting tools. Their journey turned the trade network into a living university, spreading a technological revolution at walking pace. This was the intangible economy of prehistory, where the exchange of a shell or an axe was often just the visible token for a far more valuable transaction: the sharing of an idea. We see this pattern everywhere we look. The Neolithic package of domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats did not spontaneously appear across Europe. It drifted northwest from the Fertile Crescent, its path perfectly tracing the river valleys and coastal routes used for moving obsidian and amber. The knowledge of how to sow, tend, and harvest was a migrant, passed from community to community along those same social bonds. Even artistic styles became travelers. A distinctive way of painting pottery with specific spirals or geometric patterns emerges in one region. Centuries later, a very similar design appears hundreds of miles away. This is not coincidence, it is cultural conversation. It tells us that people were connected enough for aesthetic ideas to flow, for a potter in one valley to see the work of a potter from a distant land and think, "That is beautiful, I will make something like that." The most striking examples are the monumental ones, the great stone circles and megalithic tombs that dot the Atlantic coast of Europe, from Portugal to Scotland. The idea of building with colossal stones, of aligning structures with the solstice sun, seems to have spread not by invasion but by contact. The concept traveled along the same maritime networks that moved jade axes and Baltic amber, adopted and adapted by local communities who made it their own, culminating in places like Stonehenge. This slow-motion sharing of intellectual property created a form of prehistoric globalization. It meant an innovation in metallurgy in the Caucasus could eventually influence tool-making in Britain. A breakthrough in boat building in the Mediterranean could inspire new fishing techniques in the North Sea. This cross-pollination of ideas prevented cultural stagnation on a continental scale. No society was an island, even if it was on an island. Every community was plugged into a slow, vast network of collective learning, where the greatest invention of one group could eventually become the heritage of all. The goods were the messengers, but the message was human ingenuity itself, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, until it covered the world. The hunger for salt forged the corridors, but the objects that moved along them could carry an entire cosmology. In a quiet field in southern Britain, a farmer once turned over the earth and found something impossible: a polished axe head of a deep, translucent green, cool and perfect to the touch. This was no ordinary tool. Laboratory analysis revealed its truth. This jadeite stone was born in the high peaks of the Italian Alps, over 1,500 miles away. Its journey to that British field was not an accident. It was the endpoint of a belief system made solid, traveling across a continent. During the 5th and 4th millennia before the Common Era, these exquisite jadeite axes were being crafted with meticulous care in the Alps. But they were never meant to fell a tree or break ground. Their edges are often pristine, unmarked by practical use. Their value lay entirely in their form, their material, and their impossible origin. They were ritual objects, perhaps symbols of authority, tokens of fertility, or direct conduits to the divine. To hold one was to hold a piece of a distant, sacred mountain. Archaeologists plotting their find spots see a clear pattern fanning out from the alpine source, like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. They are found in hoards and in ceremonial deposits from France to the British Isles and across Central Europe. This distribution map is a snapshot of a shared ideology. Diverse cultures speaking different languages and living in different landscapes all participated in a common understanding of value. They all desired this specific green stone from that specific far-off place. This created a prehistoric vocabulary of value, where the axe was not just an object, but a word in a silent, continent-wide conversation about power, spirituality, and connection. The effort involved is staggering to contemplate. To move a single axe that vast distance across rivers, forests, and mountain passes required a chain of interactions sustained over generations. It meant that a person in what is now Brittany understood that a person in the Alps possessed something of transcendent worth, and that someone in between was willing to facilitate the exchange. This network operated on a plane far above basic survival. It dealt in the currency of meaning. A community would invest immense social capital and resources to acquire an object with no practical function, simply because it meant something profound. That desire to possess and to share a symbol recognized across hundreds of miles reveals the ideological heartbeat of Neolithic Europe. These green axes were more than treasures. They were the anchors of a shared identity, proving that long before nations, people were bound together by a common dream of the sacred, carried patiently from hand to hand until it reached a field waiting to be plowed. That green jadeite axe in the British field presents a beautiful mystery, but also a profound puzzle for the archaeologist who finds it. Did this object arrive through a long chain of peaceful exchange, passed from village to village, or was it brought here by a person who made the entire journey themselves, a traveler or even a settler from the distant Alps? This is the fundamental challenge in mapping these ancient webs, distinguishing the movement of things from the movement of people. For decades, the evidence was silent on this point. A cache of distinctive foreign pottery could signal a vibrant trade connection, or it could simply mark the new home of a potter who had migrated with her family. The map of artifacts alone could tell two completely different stories. Modern science, however, has given us a way to listen to the individual voices within those stories. Through a technique called strontium isotope analysis, researchers can now study the chemistry locked inside ancient teeth. The minerals in our food and water leave a unique geographic signature in our dental enamel, a signature that forms in childhood and stays fixed for life. By analyzing this signature, scientists can determine with remarkable precision whether an individual grew up in the local region or far from their final resting place. This changes everything. Imagine excavating a burial site in Central Europe and finding grave goods from the Mediterranean. Strontium analysis of the individual's teeth could reveal the answer. If the isotopes match the local geology, you have strong evidence for trade, a local leader wealthy in foreign connections. If the isotopes point to a childhood near the Mediterranean coast, the story shifts. You have evidence of a person who made an epic life journey, bringing their homeland with them in memory and in material culture. The truth, as it so often is in human history, is rarely one or the other. These networks were dynamic zones of interaction, not simple delivery routes. A trader from a flint-rich region might travel the established routes for years, eventually settling down and starting a family in a community that valued his connections and knowledge. In doing so, he became a permanent bridge, a living node in the network. Similarly, the exchange of marriage partners, a powerful social glue, would naturally move both people and possessions. A woman moving to her new husband's village would bring with her the pottery styles, weaving techniques, and perhaps a treasured shell necklace from her homeland. In this way, trade and migration were not separate forces, but intertwined threads in the same fabric. A new artistic motif appearing in a region could arrive because a traded object inspired local artisans, or because a new member of the community began practicing their craft. Understanding this complex blend is the key to seeing these prehistoric networks in their full, vibrant reality. They were not just economic systems, but the very scaffolding for human mobility and cultural fusion. A slow, relentless dance where objects, ideas, and people constantly flowed together, reshaping identities and forging a connected world long before history called it by name. While the green jade axe spoke of the sacred, another stone was the sound of daily survival. In the hands of a master, a dull gray nodule of flint could sing. With precise, practiced strikes of an antler hammer, a skilled napper could release the perfect tool hidden within the stone, a leaf-shaped arrow head so symmetrical it seems impossible it was made by human hands. This was not magic, but a technology so refined it built the world. Obsidian captures our imagination with its volcanic drama, but flint and chert were the true workhorses of prehistory, the steel of the Stone Age. From the delicate needle that stitched a hide, to the heavy axe that felled a tree, to the razor-sharp blade that butchered a kill, these stones were the foundation of life itself. And just like the rare exotics, the very best flint had an address. Communities knew exactly where to find stone that fractured predictably, held a keen edge, and could be worked into the tools they depended on. This knowledge created destinations, places so important they became industrial landscapes. One of the most awe-inspiring is Grimes Graves in the heart of England. Here, the earth is pockmarked with over 400 vertical shafts, some plunging over 40 feet down through the chalk. Neolithic miners dug these pits with nothing more than antler picks and shoulder blades of oxen, following a prized seam of jet-black flint. They lit their way with lamps burning animal fat and hauled the precious nodules to the surface in baskets. This was not casual gathering, this was organized, dangerous, large-scale extraction. It means that by the late Neolithic, people were investing immense communal effort to secure their technological future. Grimes Graves was not alone. Similar mining complexes dotted Europe, from the chocolate-colored flint mines of Poland to the vast chert quarries of the Near East. These were the prehistoric equivalent of factories, producing the raw material for an entire continent's toolkit. But how did that black flint from a deep English shaft reach a settlement 50 or 100 miles away? This is where the network comes alive with human movement. The distribution of these high-quality materials suggests something fascinating, the rise of a specialized class. We can envision the itinerant flint napper, a person whose skill was their currency. Carrying a pack of premium cores from the mine, they would travel between settlements, perhaps following seasonal rounds. In each village, they would not just trade finished arrowheads or axes, they might demonstrate their craft, turning raw stone into ready-to-use technology before the community's eyes. Their arrival was an event. They supplied an essential need, but they likely brought something else just as vital: news. As they moved from group to group, they carried stories of distant events, warnings of conflicts, reports of new resources, or tales of strange sightings. They were the information network, the human thread that connected isolated communities to a wider current of events. In this role, the flint trader was more than a merchant. They were a living library and a broadcaster, their practical craft granting them safe passage and a welcome audience. The flint itself, so common and crucial, becomes a symbol of this deep, practical interconnection. While the jade axe connected ideologies and the lapis lazuli connected kings, the flint blade connected every single person, every household, to a system of shared knowledge and mutual dependence that made the wilderness a little less wild and the world a little more known. The flint knapper's route was not just a line on a map, it was a lifeline vulnerable to the sky itself. For all their social ingenuity, these ancient networks existed at the mercy of a far greater force, the climate. A prolonged drought could turn a reliable river into a treacherous chain of mudholes, severing a vital corridor. A shift in rainfall patterns might wither the grasslands that supported the herds carrying precious amber south. Environmental change was the silent partner in every exchange, a constant pressure that could destroy old routes and invent new ones. During the Holocene epoch, the relatively stable period following the last ice age, climate was not a fixed backdrop but a dynamic character in the human story. Its fluctuations repeatedly reshaped the board on which the game of trade was played. Consider a community whose identity was built around mining a particular high-quality flint from a local quarry. Generations had traded this stone for everything they needed. Then, over decades, the rains grew scarce, the water table dropped, and the quarry pits slowly filled with dust instead of workable stone. The local source, the foundation of their economy, was failing. This was not a momentary hardship, it was an existential crisis. Their choice was stark: diminish and turn inward, or look outward with newfound urgency. Such a climate-driven crisis became a powerful catalyst for connection. It forced innovation. It pushed that community to seek new partners farther afield, to learn of alternative stone sources they had never needed before, and to offer different goods or services in exchange. In this way, environmental pressure acted as a relentless engine for expanding the network's reach and complexity. Drought could also reshape the very geography of trade. A period of aridity might make river transport more difficult, but it could simultaneously elevate the importance of certain locations. A reliable spring in an otherwise parched landscape would naturally attract people and animals. This oasis would transform from a simple watering hole into a crucial nexus, a place where different migratory paths and trade routes inevitably converged. Settlements that grew around such spots became the ancient world's first freeports, neutral ground where diverse groups could meet, share news, and exchange goods under a mutual truce born of shared need. Their prosperity was built not on local resources but on their role as bridges. Conversely, a favorable climatic period, a centuries-long window of reliable rains and mild temperatures, could have the opposite but equally connective effect. Populations could expand, spilling into new valleys and coastal plains. As these new frontier settlements grew, they would seek to establish their own links back to their homelands and to new neighbors, spinning fresh threads into the existing web. This expansion did not dilute the network, it densified it, creating more nodes and more pathways for goods and ideas to flow. The lesson written in the geological and archaeological record is profound. These trade networks were not merely a luxury of stable, prosperous times. They were, in fact, a fundamental survival strategy for an unstable world. Building and maintaining external connections was a form of social resilience, a community's insurance policy against local failure. If your flint ran out, you knew who had obsidian. If your crops faltered, you had a partner in a different rainfall zone who might have surplus grain. The network itself became the adaptation, allowing human groups to buffer themselves against the shocks of a changing planet. This transforms our view of prehistoric commerce from a simple story of want into a deeper narrative of need. The desire for the exotic and the beautiful was real, but beneath it pulsed a hard-earned wisdom, that in a world of uncertainty, your greatest resource was not what you owned but who you knew. And those connections, forged in response to a shifting climate, would ultimately prove more durable than any single season's drought or flood. The silent journeys of stone and salt eventually found their voice in story. Listen to the oldest epic we know, the tale of Gilgamesh. The hero king does not seek a throne or a treasure hoard in a local cave. His quest is for the distant, legendary cedar forest, a place of towering trees and a terrifying guardian. To a Mesopotamian listener living in a land of mud brick and palm groves, the very idea of such a forest was the stuff of dreams, yet this mythical destination mirrors a profound reality. The great cedars of Lebanon were a real, vital resource, their strong, fragrant wood essential for building temples and palaces. Acquiring it required perilous journeys into the mountainous lands to the west, dealing with foreign peoples and navigating unknown trails. The epic transforms this economic necessity into a heroic trial, encoding the dangers and the immense value of that long-distance connection into the culture's foundational myth. In doing so, it preserved vital knowledge, the direction to go, the obstacles to expect, and the supreme worth of the goal. It was a story that remembered a trade route. Across the sea, another legend sails on similar currents. The Greek saga of Jason and the Argonauts is at its heart, a trade mission mythologized. Their quest for the Golden Fleece in the far-off land of Colchis, on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, is a perfect allegory for the pursuit of exotic wealth. To the ancient Greeks, this region was a source of gold, mined using sheepskins to trap particles in riverbeds, a technique that could easily inspire tales of a magical fleece. The Argonauts' voyage, with its catalogue of strange encounters and narrow escapes, reads like a dramatized sailor's log, a cultural memory of early exploratory trading voyages into that challenging sea. The story maps a psychic geography, telling listeners what lay beyond the familiar horizon, what wonders could be gained, and what terrible costs might be extracted. These narratives did more than entertain, they educated. They served as oral repositories of survival information for a culture with no written maps. They told of the people who lived at the edge of the world, of the natural hazards to avoid, and of the almost supernatural rewards that awaited those brave enough to make the journey. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. The Egyptian tale of the shipwrecked sailor speaks of a magical island rich in incense, spices, and precious stones, a clear echo of the Red Sea trade routes to the land of Punt. Norse sagas are filled with voyages to fetch walrus ivory from the far north or amber from the Baltic shores, journeys so embedded in their identity they became the fabric of their heroes' deeds. In each case, the legendary object, the fleece, the cedars, the incense island, is not merely a plot device. It is a cultural magnet, drawing the story toward the very real materials that shaped their civilization's wealth and identity. The quest narrative provided a powerful framework for understanding why people would risk everything to traverse such distances. It elevated the merchant and the explorer to the status of hero, and in doing so, it sanctified the network itself. By weaving trade into the tapestry of legend, these cultures ensured that the imperative to connect, to seek out the distant and the rare, was not just an economic strategy, but a core part of who they were. The myths were the maps, and the maps were a form of memory, ensuring that even if the routes fell silent for a generation, the knowledge of where they led and why they mattered would never be completely lost. The myths remembered the routes, but one creature would soon make them obsolete. Its story begins not on the steppes, but in a world long vanished. The horse first evolved on the grassy plains of North America, a nimble herbivore fleeing ancient predators. In a twist of deep time, some of its ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge into Asia, while those left behind on their home continent would eventually disappear. For the peoples of the Eurasian steppes, this new animal was initially just another source of meat and hide. but around 3,500 years before the Common Era, a profound shift occurred somewhere in those vast grasslands. Through a process we can only piece together, certain communities began to manage herds not for slaughter, but for milk, for labor, and ultimately for mobility. This was domestication, a partnership that would redraw the map of human possibility. The horse did not just join the trade network, it supercharged it. Prior to this, the speed of exchange was limited by the pace of a human on foot or the current of a river. Now, distance itself began to contract. A journey that might have taken a trading party weeks could be accomplished in days. The scale of what could be transported expanded dramatically, as horses could carry heavier loads farther and faster than any human porter. But the true transformation was not the pack horse, it was the chariot. By the second millennium before the Common Era, a revolutionary technology emerged from the steppes, the lightweight, spoked-wheel chariot pulled by a pair of horses. This was not merely a vehicle, it was a system, a package of advanced carpentry, leatherworking, and animal husbandry. And like the ideas of farming or metallurgy before it, this package began to travel. Its spread was breathtakingly rapid, a clear signal of intense, high-level exchange. Chariot technology appeared almost simultaneously in the royal courts of Mesopotamia, the pharaonic stables of Egypt, and the nascent kingdoms of China. This could not have been a case of independent invention. It was the result of a network, a conduit for elite knowledge and goods that now operated at a new velocity. Kings and warriors across continents recognized the chariot's dual power as a supreme platform for warfare and a potent symbol of divine and royal authority. To acquire this technology, they needed the horses themselves, the trainers, and the craftsmen. This created a booming, pan-continental demand for both the animal and the specialized knowledge to use it, forging diplomatic and trade connections of unprecedented scale and urgency. The movement of the horse thus represents the ultimate prehistoric trade good, one that came with its own infrastructure and fundamentally altered the parameters of connection itself. It increased the speed of communication, the volume of trade, and the reach of military power. The steppe cultures, once on the periphery of the agricultural civilizations, suddenly found themselves at the center of a new web, their mastery of the horse making them indispensable brokers and formidable neighbors. This ancient network of horse and chariot exchange laid down the very pathways and established the logistical understanding that would, centuries later, enable the Silk Road. A single traded species, once a humble source of food, had become the engine of history, proving that the most powerful cargo in any network is not an object but a new capability. And as these networks grew faster and more interwoven, they began to face their greatest test not from the environment, but from the very complexity they had created. The horse carried more than goods and warriors. It carried the unseen cargo of humanity itself, the very ideas and biological signatures that would rewrite our collective story with every mile traveled. These invisible commodities flowed along the same routes as jade and amber, often leaving a deeper mark than any physical treasure. Every time a trader learned a new word for salt from a distant partner, or a storyteller wove a foreign deity into a local legend, the network was trading in its most potent currency, knowledge. Languages absorbed loanwords for exotic materials and unfamiliar animals, creating a linguistic map of ancient contact. Myths themselves became composite creations, as gods and heroes from one culture hitched a ride on a trader's tale and found a new home far from their origin. This slow, relentless syncretism meant that no culture was ever truly isolated, its identity constantly refreshed by whispers from the trail. The most intimate exchange, however, was written directly into the human body. Modern DNA studies now reveal a stunning truth. These ancient pathways were also thoroughfares for genes. The gradual, widespread mixing of populations across Europe and Asia, visible in the genetic record, did not happen through massive invasions alone. It was the cumulative result of countless individual journeys, of marriages arranged between allied trading families, of artisans settling in new communities, and of small family groups migrating along established, safer routes. Each connection, each partnership, left a subtle genetic signature, weaving a biological tapestry that mirrored the social and economic web. People were not just moving objects, they were moving themselves, and in doing so, they slowly blended the human landscape. This profound connectivity, however, had a shadow side. The same routes that spread new crops and brilliant ideas also provided a highway for less welcome travelers, pathogens. Isolated communities, once protected by distance, became vulnerable when linked to a wider world. An illness that arose in one densely populated river valley could, over time, hop from settlement to settlement along trade corridors, potentially reaching populations with no prior immunity. While specific prehistoric epidemics are lost to time, the pattern is etched into later history, from the plagues of the Roman era to the catastrophic exchanges following Columbus. The architecture of trade, with its regular stopping points and concentrations of people and animals, created ideal conditions for diseases to spread. This dynamic presents a fundamental paradox of human progress. The very networks that fostered resilience, innovation, and cultural richness also became vectors for shared vulnerability. Our ancestors' drive to connect, which brought them the wealth of continents, also bound their fates together in sickness and in health, setting a pattern that would echo through every chapter of our interconnected story. The invisible currents of disease revealed the network's hidden cost, but another material would forge its greatest triumph from pure necessity. A metalsmith, perhaps in a smoky workshop in ancient Mesopotamia, made a discovery that would redefine an era. He had copper, plentiful and malleable, from the great mines of Cyprus, and he had a small, rare ingot of a dull gray metal, tin, carried from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. Separately, they were useful. Combined in the right proportion and heated, they underwent a magical transformation, merging into a new, superior substance, bronze. This was not just an improvement, it was a revolution in solid form. Bronze was harder than copper, held a sharper edge, and could be cast into intricate shapes. It created better weapons, more durable tools, and magnificent art. But this revolution came with a geographical catch, a profound puzzle written into the earth itself. Copper and tin ore are almost never found in the same place. A society could have vast copper deposits right outside its village, but without access to that elusive tin, it could never enter the Bronze Age. This simple geological fact made long-distance trade not a luxury, but an absolute requirement for survival and power. The entire period, from roughly 3,300 to 1,200 before the Common Era, was built upon a foundation of forced connection. Communities were no longer simply exchanging pleasantries with beautiful shells. They were now utterly dependent on invisible partners hundreds, even thousands of miles away. The networks became supply chains, vital arteries pumping the lifeblood of progress across continents. Cypriot copper, known by its classical name AES cyprium, became the standard for the entire eastern Mediterranean. Its distinctive ingots, shaped like stretched ox hides for easy transport, have been found in shipwrecks and hoards from Anatolia to Egypt. Meanwhile, the tin needed to transform that copper likely began an even more epic journey from sources in Central Asia, traveling along routes that may have supplied both the gleaming cities of Mesopotamia and the sophisticated, planned metropolises of the Indus Valley civilization. Imagine the complexity, the sheer number of hands and agreements required to bring these two isolated elements together at a single smelter's furnace. This necessity reshaped the world politically. To secure these flows, chieftains had to evolve into kings, and villages into states with the administrative power to organize, protect, and finance expeditions. It forced the invention of diplomacy as rulers sent envoys to negotiate with distant powers controlling crucial mines or mountain passes. Treaties were no longer just about peace, they were about procurement. And yes, it also spurred conflict, as competition for access to these scarce resources could turn trade routes into battlefields. The need for bronze, therefore, became a primary engine for early state formation. It demanded centralized authority to manage the risk and reward of long-distance exchange. It fostered the growth of merchant classes, the standardization of weights and measures, and the development of more complex record-keeping, pushing the boundaries of early writing. The trade network was no longer just a social web. It was the economic and political skeleton of civilization itself. In this light, a bronze sword is more than a weapon. It is a symbol of a world already deeply, irrevocably interdependent, a testament to the fact that humanity's greatest leaps forward have always required us to reach beyond our own horizons and trust in the promise of a distant hand. That bronze sword was forged by a network of necessity, but its journey across the sea depended on a different kind of knowledge, written not in ledgers but in the night sky. For the ancient mariner, there were no charts, no compass, and no land in sight for weeks. His map was the living world itself. He knew the stars not as distant lights but as constant, rotating guides. He understood the language of the wind on his face, the subtle shift in swell patterns that whispered of a distant atoll still below the horizon. He watched the flight paths of birds, knowing certain species would only fly toward land. This was wayfinding, a supreme intellectual art that turned the terrifying emptiness of the open ocean into a navigable highway. In the vast Pacific, this knowledge reached its zenith. Centuries before European explorers dared such voyages, Polynesian navigators were settling islands scattered across millions of square miles of open water. They used mental star compasses, memorizing the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars to hold a course. They read the ocean's surface like a book, interpreting the refraction of swells against distant islands, the color of the clouds, and the behavior of marine life. This was not guesswork, it was a rigorous, orally transmitted science, a priceless intellectual commodity that made the peopling of the Pacific possible. Each successful voyage was a trade mission of sorts, carrying not just people and plants, but the very knowledge of how to return, weaving a web of connection across the world's greatest ocean. In the Mediterranean, the challenge was different but the principle the same. Early sailors navigated by cabotage, sailing within sight of land, using the sun's arc and familiar mountain silhouettes as their guides. They learned the seasonal winds, like the reliable artesian winds of summer, and used them as natural engines for their journeys. This accumulated environmental wisdom, passed from master to apprentice in song, story, and direct experience, was the true treasure. It was more valuable than any cargo because it was the key to fetching all other cargo. The development of the sail transformed this art into a world-shaping force. A simple square sail harnessing the wind meant a vessel could travel farther, faster, and carry immensely more than a crew of rowers ever could. It allowed for the direct crossing of open seas, like the route from Crete to Egypt, turning what was once a perilous coastal trek into a manageable passage. The sail effectively shrank the prehistoric world, binding continents with strands of maritime knowledge. A trading ship could now carry tons of olive oil, grain, or copper ingots, making the movement of bulk goods economically viable for the first time. This maritime network, powered by wind and guided by celestial memory, became the silent superhighway of the ancient world, where the greatest cargo was always the knowledge of how to find your way back home and then to venture out again. The sail made the ocean a highway, but every highway needs a destination. Deep in the heart of Anatolia, a city rose without streets. Its inhabitants moved across rooftops, descending ladders into their homes to find walls adorned with the horns of wild bulls and murals of distant, soaring birds. This was Catalhoyuk, a dense, buzzing hive of humanity thriving over 9,000 years ago. Its lifeblood was not just the local soil, but the goods that arrived from far beyond the horizon. Obsidian from nearby volcanic flows was its primary export, a black gold that brought the world to its doorstep. In return, the people of Catalhoyuk received seashells from the Mediterranean, flint from distant hills, and the vivid blue mineral azurite for pigment, each object a stitch in a vast, invisible fabric connecting them to other cultures. This was not a village, it was a hub, one of the world's first great gathering points where the threads of regional trade wove together into something entirely new, an urban tapestry. A similar story, yet astonishingly different in form, unfolded thousands of miles to the east. Centuries later, on the fertile plains of the Indus River, the city of Mohenjo-Daro was built with a ruler's precision. Its streets ran in perfect grids, with advanced drainage systems channeling water beneath baked brick lanes. Here, standardization was king. Archaeologists have found meticulously crafted stone weights, following a uniform system across the entire Indus Valley civilization. This was not for local barter, it was for large-scale, regulated commerce. The city's large, windowless buildings near the citadel are thought to be massive granaries and warehouses, storing surplus grain not just for local need but for trade. Mohenjo-Daro's artisans used lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from Gujarat, and gold possibly from southern India, materials that speak of procurement networks spanning the subcontinent and beyond. The city's very design, its order and its storage capacity, points to a society whose economy and identity were built around managed exchange. These two hubs, one organic and labyrinthine, the other planned and regimented, reveal the same fundamental truth. Great early cities were not self-contained miracles. They were creations of the network. They emerged at natural crossroads, at the confluence of rivers, near rich resource deposits, or along well-established coastal routes. Their wealth and astonishing complexity were directly fueled by the constant flow of goods and people. A merchant from the highlands would arrive with a load of rare timber, a sailor would disembark with a cargo of exotic shells, and a caravan master would present ingots of foreign copper. In the bustling markets and workshops, these materials converged. A local craftsperson, inspired by a foreign beads design, might innovate a new style of pottery. A builder, seeing the strength of imported timber, might devise a new architectural technique. The city became a crucible for innovation, a place where distant ideas collided and sparked new forms of art, technology, and social organization. This constant influx did more than stimulate the economy, it reshaped culture itself. Walking through Catalhoyuk, you would see murals that might depict landscapes or rituals influenced by stories from travelers. In Mohenjo-Daro, you might find seals depicting creatures like the unicorn, a symbol that likely carried meaning for trading partners far away. These cities were the ancient world's first global melting pots, where the local and the foreign continuously blended. The very presence of standardized weights and large storage facilities tells us that commerce was not an afterthought. It was a central pillar of civic life. It required administration, trust, and a shared understanding of value that could bridge different languages and backgrounds. The hub city, therefore, was the ultimate expression of the prehistoric network. It was the place where the slow, silent river of down-the-line exchange finally pooled, creating a reservoir of human creativity, connection, and ambition that would set the stage for everything that followed. The grand hubs of Catalhoyuk and Mohenjo-Daro stood as monuments to a connected world, but around 1,200 years before the Common Era, that world began to shudder. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, a wave of profound crisis washed over the great Bronze Age kingdoms. Palaces that had administered the flow of copper and tin for centuries were consumed by fire. Centralized bureaucracies vanished. The meticulously maintained correspondence between kings, which guaranteed the safe passage of ingots and lapis lazuli, fell silent. This was not a local event, it was a systemic failure, a collapse of the very political order that had structured long-distance exchange for generations. The organized, elite-controlled arteries of trade, those vital supply chains for bronze, were severed. For a moment, it must have seemed as if the network itself had died. Yet, in the silence that followed the collapse, a different sound emerged. It was not the grand decree of a palace scribe, but the chatter of bargaining in 100 small coastal harbors. The great centralized system had broken, but the human need to connect had not. What arose from the ashes was something more agile, more decentralized, and in many ways more democratic. The ensuing Iron Age saw a transformation in how trade worked. Without the heavy hand of royal monopolies, opportunity opened for smaller players. Local chieftains, village cooperatives, and independent merchant families could now participate directly. Trade routes became less like formal state highways and more like a sprawling web of footpaths, each trodden by individuals seeking their own fortune. This shift lowered the barrier to entry. A prosperous farmer with a surplus of grain or olive oil could now feasibly barter for a fine piece of imported pottery or a metal tool, deals that were once the exclusive domain of the palace treasury. No one exemplified this new, resilient model better than the Phoenicians. Emerging from the coastal cities of the Levant, like Tyre and Sidon, they were not conquerors building vast inland empires. They were navigators, opportunists of the sea. With the old palace networks in disarray, they looked westward across the Mediterranean and saw not a void, but a mosaic of possibilities. They built sleek, fast ships capable of long open water voyages, and they established not colonies in the traditional sense, but trading posts, neutral grounds for exchange. From Gadir, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, they brought back silver. From the coasts of North Africa, they accessed gold and ivory. Most famously, from a certain shellfish, they produced a vibrant purple dye so rare and costly it became the color of royalty. The Phoenician Network was a commercial empire built on lightweight infrastructure, on adaptability, and the direct fulfillment of demand. They connected the fragmented markets of the post-collapse world, proving that commerce could not only survive a dark age, but could actively illuminate a way out of it. This profound transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age reveals the deepest truth about these networks. They are not fragile artifacts dependent on any single king or city. They are resilient patterns of human behavior. A network can shatter, its nodes can go dark, and its most treasured routes can fall into disuse. Yet the fundamental impulse to seek out others, to exchange what you have for what you need or desire, is unstoppable. It is a constant in human history. When one form is broken by crisis, that impulse simply finds a new expression, evolving to fit the new realities of the world. The collapse did not end trade, it forced trade to reinvent itself, becoming more fluid, more accessible, and ultimately, more deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. The story does not conclude with an ending, but with a transformation, a reminder that connection is our species' most durable invention. The most transformative cargo was never mined or carved, but grown. It began with a handful of seeds carried in a leather pouch or a small flock of animals driven along a dusty trail. This was the trade in life itself, a biological network that moved not in years, but in generations, permanently rewriting the map of human possibility. The first and greatest of these organic exchanges was the Neolithic package, a suite of living technologies that drifted out of the Fertile Crescent. It included domesticated wheat and barley, pulses like lentils and peas, and the foundational livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. This was not a single migration, but a slow, relentless diffusion. its path tracing the same river valleys and coastal routes used for obsidian and shells. Each time a farming community traded surplus seed grain to their foraging neighbors, or exchanged a breeding pair of sheep for fine flint tools, they were transferring an entire way of life. The acceptance of these new species was a monumental choice. It meant committing to a settled existence, to the rhythms of the planting season and the demands of animal husbandry. It bound people to a specific plot of land, generation after generation, fostering the growth of permanent villages and the accumulation of surplus wealth. This biological trade did more than change diets. It fundamentally altered human social structures, paving the way for everything from property rights to inherited leadership. Later waves of this organic exchange would ripple across other continents with similar world-shaping force. In East Asia, the domestication of millet in the north and rice in the south created two distinct agricultural heartlands. Over centuries, these crops began to move, carried along emerging trade corridors. Rice cultivation techniques, requiring sophisticated water management, traveled slowly westward from China into Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, transforming wetlands into fertile paddies that could support immense populations. Meanwhile, in Africa, grains like sorghum and pearl millet, resilient in drier climates, spread across the Sahel, enabling communities to thrive in challenging environments and establishing new networks of exchange across the Sahara's fringes. The movement of these staple crops was an act of profound trust and long-term planning. You were not just acquiring food, you were adopting a new calendar, a new set of skills, and a new relationship with the very soil beneath your feet. The impact of trading a living thing was of a different magnitude than trading a stone axe. A precious jadeite ceremonial object might signify status for a century, but a successful breed of sheep could feed and clothe a community for a millennium. The introduction of a new crop could allow a population to double, forcing the clearing of forests and the founding of new settlements. It could provide a stable surplus that freed some individuals from farming altogether, leading to specialization, artisans, priests, and warriors. This biological network literally reshaped landscapes, as forests were felled for fields and terraces were carved into hillsides. It altered the very genetics of the plants and animals themselves, as people selectively bred for desirable traits, creating countless local varieties adapted to specific soils and climates. The humble trade in seeds and livestock was the ultimate slow investment, one whose dividends were paid not in shells or metal, but in the survival and flourishing of countless generations to come. While kings fought over mines and merchants braved seas for spices, the quiet, relentless exchange of a wheat kernel or a ewe laid the unshakable agricultural foundation upon which every palace, every city, and every empire would ultimately be built. A modern highway curves through an alpine valley, its asphalt tracing a line first walked 10,000 years ago. The most profound legacy of these ancient networks is not in a museum case, but under our feet, woven into the very skin of the earth. The simple, repeated act of walking from a flint mine to a settlement, season after season, generation after generation, did something permanent. It wore a desire line into the landscape, a groove of human intention that time could not erase. These footpaths, forged by necessity, became the unconscious blueprints for all future movement. The ridgeline trail used by Neolithic herders to move sheep became the track for Bronze Age traders carrying copper, which later guided Roman engineers laying their famed straight roads. That Roman road, in turn, often dictated the route of a medieval pilgrimage path, which eventually became the foundation for a modern country lane. The corridor itself possessed a stubborn inertia, outliving every civilization that used it. We can still walk these palimpsest paths today. In southern England, the Icknield Way is an ancient trackway following the chalk ridges, used since the Stone Age for transporting flint and later for moving livestock. It never was a single constructed road, but a broad traditional route, a highway of grass and earth that served as a major artery long before the Romans arrived. Similarly, the Amber Road, the legendary route for Baltic amber to reach the Mediterranean, began as a series of river fords and mountain passes known to prehistoric traders. Centuries later, these same points of crossing would be fortified with castles and toll stations, their economic logic unchanged. The geography of trade created a kind of memory in the land, a logic of least resistance that every subsequent culture recognized and adopted. This physical legacy extends beyond mere routes to the very places we consider sacred or significant. A spring that served as a vital watering hole for ancient salt traders naturally became a gathering place, a spot for ritual and exchange. Over centuries, that practical site might accumulate burials, then a shrine, then a church, its original purpose forgotten but its location forever sanctified by timeless footfall. A hilltop that offered a clear vantage point for navigating a trade corridor might later be chosen as the site for a hill fort, then a castle, its strategic value first recognized by those ancient pathfinders. The locations of our towns and cities often whisper of these old connections. A thriving medieval market town frequently sits at the confluence of two rivers, a place where prehistoric canoe traffic would have naturally met and mingled. So when you drive through a mountain pass or hike a long-distance trail, you are participating in a ritual of movement older than history. The asphalt beneath the tires, the gravel under your boots, they are merely the latest layers on a pathway carved by the endless, silent journeys of people carrying shells, stone, and salt. Those ephemeral exchanges of material did more than connect cultures. They sculpted the physical stage upon which all later history would play out. They directed where armies marched, where pilgrims traveled, and where cities rose. The ancient network's greatest gift was not the objects it moved, but the channels it dug into the world, invisible grooves that continue to guide us, pulling us along the same lines of connection that have always drawn humanity toward the horizon. So step back and look at the map. See it not as a collection of isolated dots marking villages or graves, but as a living, breathing web. From the Alpine passes to the Arabian coast, from the Baltic forests to the Aegean shores, lines of connection pulse with movement. They carry the black sheen of Anatolian obsidian, the golden warmth of Baltic amber, the deep blue of Afghan Lapis Lazuli, and the green promise of Alpine jade. They carry sacks of grain, bundles of hides, and pots of precious salt. But more than that, they carry a whisper, the slow, patient exchange of a story, a technique, a song, a seed. This is the cumulative picture that emerges from a century of quiet detective work. The evidence from scattered artifacts, from chemical fingerprints in teeth and stone, from shared words and shared genes, now converges into a single, undeniable narrative. The world of the Holocene, our world after the ice, was not a collection of lonely islands of humanity. It was a planet already in conversation. This challenges a deep-seated assumption in how we view our own past. For generations, the textbook image of prehistory was one of isolation, of small, self-sufficient bands focused solely on their immediate survival, cut off from anything beyond the next valley. What this new map reveals is the opposite. These were dynamic, outward-looking cultures engaged in a continuous, slow-motion dialogue across staggering distances. A farmer in Central Europe knew, through the objects he possessed and the stories he heard, that his world was connected to a wider one. A shell from a distant sea was not just a pretty trinket, it was proof. This long-term, low-volume exchange was the prehistoric equivalent of the Internet, a system for sharing information, innovation, and identity at a continental scale. That realization forces us to reconsider a very modern idea, globalization. We often speak of it as a product of the last few centuries, born from steamships, telegraphs, and satellite networks. But the pulsating web on this ancient map suggests something profound. Globalization is not a modern invention, it is a human pattern. The scale and speed are new, but the underlying drive is as ancient as the first time one person offered a piece of fine flint to another in exchange for a promise of safe passage. Our desire to explore beyond the horizon, to acquire the exotic, to learn from the different, and to weave our fate with others is not a late development in our story. It is woven into the foundation of who we are. It is as fundamental to our species as making tools or using language. We have always been network builders. The story of these prehistoric trade routes, then, is not a prelude to history. It is the first, longest, and perhaps most meaningful chapter of history itself, written not in words, but in the silent, eloquent journeys of a seashell, a stone axe, and an idea that refused to stay home. That deep-rooted human saga continues with every connection we make. The prehistoric trade networks were indeed the silent architects of our world, laying down the psychological and physical infrastructure for everything that followed. They wove continents together with threads of obsidian, salt, and story long before the first written word. This was a world built not on conquest, but on curiosity, on the persistent, patient drive to reach beyond the known. From the Jade axes carried across Europe to the Afghan Lapis Lazuli gracing Egyptian royalty, these exchanges reveal our ancestors not as isolated survivors, but as ambitious connectors. They were builders of relationships across unimaginable divides, mastering rivers and reading stars to forge bonds that turned strangers into partners. Their greatest trade was never in material alone. They exchanged the very seeds of civilization itself, ideas, technologies, beliefs, and biological innovations that allowed humanity to adapt, innovate, and flourish. The shared knowledge of metalworking, the slow drift of wheat and rice across continents, the transmission of a sacred symbol, these were the true treasures moving along those ancient paths. They created a form of resilience, a global safety net woven from social obligation and mutual interest. As we reflect on our own hyper-connected modern era, with its instant communication and global supply chains, we can see it not as a sudden rupture, but as the latest, fastest chapter in this enduring story. The scale and speed are new, but the fundamental impulse is ancient. We are still those same network builders, still driven by that same need to seek, to share, and to weave our individual threads into a larger, stronger fabric. Our world was built by connections, and it is through understanding those first, fragile threads that we truly understand ourselves. If this journey into our profoundly connected past resonated with you, please subscribe for more explorations into history's greatest mysteries. We would love to hear your thoughts. Which ancient trade item, from obsidian blades to cowrie shells, fascinates you the most?